every time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay. I don't know just what to do. I just know, darling, I'm in love with you.
Hello and welcome to There and Then. I'm your host, Tom Gutteridge. This is a podcast where we talk about the collected works of one Canadian author, my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and how they relate to writing, history, and his life. This is a very special mini-sode. Don and I just had another full conversation about some of his novels, and that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. But for now, we have something very special for you. Let me take you back to 1973. In 1973, if you'll remember, Grandpa's book, Riel, A Poem for Voices, was first released by Van Nostrand Reinhold. It's a beautiful edition, and it's still out there in the resale market if you're inclined to check it out. It's a great book. It's beautiful, and Riel is one of the works Grandpa is most proud of, and I think it's one of the most readable of his mythics. So it's one that I would really encourage you to check out. But one thing Grandpa told me a while ago was that, excuse me. One thing Grandpa told me a while ago was that the year of its release, the CBC radio actually did a staged production of Riel, A Poem for Voices. We have the tape. It took some doctoring, so I think it went from reel to cassette to CD to me. The audio wasn't great when I first got a hold of it, and it's still only okay, but you'll get the gist of it. It's really a fantastically produced project and really wonderful. The CBC used some pretty heavy-hitter actors, including some well-known people. Grandpa gave me the cast list, and maybe I'll post that for everyone to enjoy. Riel's, of course, one of the heavy hitters in Canadian history. The thing to remember about Riel, A Poem for Voices is that in 1973, Louis Riel hadn't really attained the status that he has today as one of our founding fathers of Confederation, as it were. He was still, widely regarded. He was well known, but his public rehabilitation hadn't really taken root quite yet, and I like to think that Grandpa's very sympathetic treatment of Riel was a little ahead of its time, and I think history has vindicated that approach. This is an interesting production. You can tell it's the 70s at times. It gets downright trippy. I've really had a great time listening to it. I think you will really enjoy it. So, without any further ado, I take you to the CBC's 1973 production of Riel, A Poem for Voices.
But you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
They were walking this road together, his father and he, his legs of 14 years moving in steady stride with the older man's, lean muscled with the years of the buffalo hunt and the long cart trek up from St. Cloud, were two men striding together as one, though their eyes and hearts were already taking other directions. His father's north to St. Boniface and home, his own south and east to St. Paul, and then on to the shadowed, half-fabled valley of his ancestors where, his father had told him, the cathedral towers grew like straight, true trees from the rock shoulders of the St. Lawrence and beyond, to the sloping back of the land endlessly green, to the world sea whose roundness was greater than Agassiz. We're walking as one this dust-ridden Pembina road. The dust of the prairie coming with the wind that was everywhere seemed to rise out of the flatness of the land and fall again to farther flatness, a dust moving on to dust. We're walking one line, though the road would branch soon. his father going back to where the two rivers, Red and Assiniboine, came together with a soft violence of current, and then ran like separate limbs of a single runner to the lake below. And he would journey east to one of his two beginnings, to the river with French accents and stone towers growing to sky. Did great rivers ever touch at their beginning or their end? In some secret lake? Beneath the flat wind plain? Under some far tundra? In the blood of one's veins? Father Richaud, he remembered, had explained it to them, what it was to be a bois brûlé. He liked that better than métis because it sang to him of the courage of wood and the 7 oaks of honor, and the swoop and drop of the falcon on that day he knew about only from the tongues of his elders and the sudden light in their eyes. The métis were like the Red River, the priest had said, where it was joined by the Assiniboine, two great currents fused in one strong flowing to the lake of the sky that waited for and cared for them all. They were walking, as a métis always walked, because a man could feel the Mother Earth through the palms of his feet and know the firmness of her flesh and the great unturning heart at the center of her. We're walking because walking told in every stride of man's moving over the earth in a passing as brief as a footprint, and because a métis found in walking a togetherness of spirit, of flesh, knowing the same earth at the same turning of the sun or the season. And a man moving was like the winds loving of the deep grasses, and did not stand like the rocks and die with stillness in the bones. And because walking made spring out of muscle and limb, and a man could feel his body lean as a willow in its long greenness, and because there was a joy in a métis walking with himself for his brother. These things had been told him by his elders, and he had felt them.
A letter to the globe. There is, in truth, a prospective poetry in the soil here, a poetry of comfort and independence. Comfort not to be wrung from the sour and ungracious earth by slavish and destructive labor, and independence unpurchased by years of biting anxiety and a constitution in ruins. But who should come in and purchase this land? The question's easily answered. Any farmer who has 300 pounds of capital and provisions to subsist his family for at least 1 year. He should also bring his seed grain, a Pittsburgh plow, harrow teeth, and a separate mower. And he'd had no difficulty in selecting a farm. There's no Hobson's choice about it, this or none. The cake is 700 miles long and 400 miles wide, and plenty of elbow room. Here at the western terminus of the proposed route from Canada are the 3 prime desiderata of a husbandman: land, wood, and water. Land, upon whose bosom has withered the enriching and procreant vegetation of centuries. Land which drops fatness as if in the fulfillment of prophecy. At once generous and abundant, and more durable than its tiller. Signed, Charles Mayer.
There would be little of walking hereafter, when the cart trail ended at St. Cloud, and he would see the railroad for the first time. Twin band of iron, he had been told, stretched across the plain, drawing a straight line to horizon's roundness, bringing the sun closer, a steel tongue intoning its single word into empty western sky, of brick towers and stone spires, and the square roads of white man's magnificence. So, this might be a last walk in the togetherness of spirit, and he was happy just to feel his father's strides coincide with his own, and liking the town spread around them, its dirt roads meandering as a man might, the houses cut out of sod, out of prairie, seeming to grow with lay of the land, to bend with wind and the leaning grasses. Like home, he thought, where he would leave his mother's house to help in the fields, or sometimes to wander along the river's bank, the Seine when his father had been a miller, and later on the Red, liking the feel of current pulling at his feet, pulling him past the green wedges of the farms. Or sometimes he would walk straight back along the line of his father's strip until he reached the commons, cows pasturing quietly. Then on to open prairie, where there were no lines, but a flat breast of grass plain rolling to distant sky, though sky was close as wind, and grasses moved yet stayed the same. And when his legs had had their fill of wandering, and the eyes tired of flatness, of a sun everywhere, there would be the long, safe arm of the farmland leading back to water, to his mother's house. That house had been his whole life once. The fields were a stretching away of the growth that began and ended there. Even the cathedral seemed an extension, in stone and twin spires, of the love he learned at the altar of his mother's voice and arms and hands. And there was in it more than merely church or rich soil could give. There was taste of old ways, profound as stone or prairie. He loved the stories she told over and over to the firelight and the listening dusk and the quick gathering of children's ears. The legend of Anne-Marie la Gemaudière, crossing a desert of sun, of rock, of lake, and carrying in her womb a child of the St. Lawrence, out of sea, out of lost Normandy, carrying child and love to darker winters and deeper waters than man had ever borne. Her lover there at her side, an ancient Adam paddling into wilderness, on currents strong with promise of sudden spring and green ending. And that one scene told over and over, ears leaning to firelight now to hear of Anne-Marie lying in the wigwam, ringed by brown Cree faces, by eyes curious to know the mystery of white motherhood. Brown hands, strangers, knowing, drawing a French child into his first winter, his cries weaving white veils delicately against the cold. Cree voices, low, incantatory, strangely muffled by the buffalo robes spiraling around them and up to the dark temple of sky, and night snow like music and the wind its harp, singing of the first white woman of the West, who was still legend, and their grandmother. So his life, as it seemed to eyes that had known but 14 summers, was made of home and land, of prairie and church, of father's memory, the fight at Seven Oaks, the struggle for justice, Louis Riel, miller of the Seine, and a man among the Métis. There was the other thing, wind moving, the palms of God through the tall hair of the grasses, parting them in a kind of prayer. And prairie sand would lift to sun face and then fall to folds of flowing out of stillness into cassocks, spread out at the foot of the Seven Oak sky. And sometimes in the dusk, with the earth taste still on his tongue, with the grit still under the fingernails, with the sun's stare still pressing on the bared eye, with the plow's handle still curved in the palms, the land would lean westward and blend with the 7 towers of the sky, would be taken into that tallness a moment, and he, Louis Riel, held a moment between nowhere and everywhere in a fold flowing, until the high tower would bend benignly down to touch his stillness with a stillness of its own. Yes, there would be little of walking hereafter, for he would go to this valley of cathedrals, this river of his second blood, and though it seemed to his 14 years and the straightness of his youth that this journey was a leaving, a parting of currents. Perhaps he could find the place where the hands of the two waters met and touched and made a roundness. Perhaps the great stone towers would burn through his prayers like a crucifix, and he, alone, would carry back to the Bois Brûlés in his cupped palms the seed of a new beginning.
Indians having asked for liquor and promised to decamp and hunt well all summer, I gave them some. Grand Guel stabbed Capot Rouge, Leboeuf stabbed his young wife in the arm, Little Shell almost beat his old mother's brains out with a club. There was terrible fighting among them. I sowed garden seeds.
Yes. One had to admit, despite all other deficiencies, that the red currants were superior. And this fine old country jam... Snow could construct jams much better than roads. It proved the best remedy yet for this pertinacious constipation which had plagued him heartily since his arrival. At least it selected the bowel as a base of operations. Not like that ass mare, suffering loudly from acute constipation of the brain. Nevertheless, one got on. There were strings to pull and letters to devise. One survived, even hoped, in spite of this wind, whose sole purpose he divined was to carry the whole prairie plague of sand against the intrusive and vulnerable eye of his Canadian party. The savages, he'd been told, could stand bare-eyed and brazen-faced in a dust storm and never flinch. One survived, though there were difficulties. Snow, getting himself dumped unceremoniously into that creek by the hot-blooded Scot, he would cause them real trouble some day. And the stupid mayor, receiving the first reviews of his literary effusions there on the floor of the Fort Garry post office at the critical and unfavorable end of a horsewhip. The irate ladies had mauled the buffalo rhymer and sometime epic bard with considerable acumen. Still, one had the Canadian party's reputation to uphold, so the letters were sent, and stanzas composed and exacerbated with the fervor of outraged artistry. He had departed soon to inspect Snow at the Dawson Road and check the little store at Oak Point along the way. MacDougall would come soon. The letter was there on the desk, smiling, official, full of pomp and patronage. And for all the minor profits of Assiniboine politics, it would mean millennium. And though his natural modesty forbade him to say it, he often admitted quite candidly to himself that he deserved it. 21 he'd been when he descended with as much decorum as possible from his perch on the Red River cart and took his first eyeful of Prince Rupert's land. He could not hear, of course, because the protestations of the wooden wheels had ingrained themselves forever on his eardrums. In his fist he had brandished a medical degree, though he did not practice long, being deterred, as it were, by disease itself. This slow dysentery of the soul he saw everywhere propagated by the priests, spread by the Métis with an incestuous zeal. Swore the old men who remembered some bloodbath at Seven Oaks generations ago fed the pestilence to swarthy young men who carried the buffalo stench of their summer's pilgrimage straight to the altar, which priests like Richaud and Taché were quick to bless. It was a disease one couldn't cure, but there were ways to deal with it. One might say utilize, quietly to oneself. There had been other maladies, of course. The smallpox. He'd heard the recent rumors about the plague among the Crees and the Blackfeet, and the grasshoppers coming with a rain of darkness, and worse, this wind madness which both white and savage seemed to pick up with the prairie dust whenever the soul was exposed to that supreme emptiness with only the wind to fill it, and not fill it, and they would carry it back with them in their eyes. The Nor'wester had proved, though, a superior elixir for his fortunes, and after all, one had to believe in some cause, and the West would be caught up in the orange thrust and commercial sweep, as it were, of Ontario. Sir John A. under stone towers, piecing the blocks together, remembering old friends. The Dawson Road contract had been a surprise package, though it meant having snow under and on one's roof at the same time. And after him, Mayor, whose politic manoeuvres were more obvious and less successful than his importunate iambicizing. The store played its role, too, and one got on. Flour, $18 a barrel, 14 at Fort Garry. The workers, though, were a long way from the town, and even the Métis succumbed to the subtle persuasions of hunger. If Dennis could only keep both thumbs planted on his tongue, and Mac's arrogance survived the Minnesota dust, then the lodge had been a masterstroke. He'd almost forgotten it. Was that a pain in the lower bowel? A sly fist curled somehow without his knowing within. The lodge. Yes, a masterstroke. He'd called it the Northern Lights. The first temple of the Masons to be erected on Western soil. And if the priests had spread, along with other assorted pestilence, rumors about secret and abominable rites served in the inner sanctum of a clapboard house of a certain Protestant gentleman, then who was he to gainsay the word of the true cloth? From that point he'd made his way by epistles surreptitious and 3 dusty pilgrimages to Ottawa and the East, and to the Right Honourable Minister of Public Works, who would, in the fullness of time, soon work miracles. And so one got along, survived, dared to hope, with red currants and a house full of strangers.
Letter to the Globe. Most of the woods here are substitutional or secondary. The primeval growth was possibly oak, an immense forest of which probably covered the surface now usurped by lighter and inferior timber. The charred oak stumps are still to be seen here and there among the young aspens which have sprung up in their stead. A great quantity of this young timber has been destroyed by windfalls, the force and range of which must have been terrific. For everywhere are to be seen trees whose tops have been snapped off like pipe stems. And the earth is strewn with their trunks in all directions. Signed, Charles Mayer.
Connection was surely more than event. Would the journey east had been event, on steel bands straight as a gun barrel, sights on a western sun. And yet it was connection too. Cathedral bells murmured in his ears, but the mind knew their softness, and stone towers grew skyward, twin yearnings, so much stronger than the little church at home, though these spires too did not touch, and there was space above them for the wind. It was the same when he first walked the narrow cobbled streets down to the wharf. The cobbles hard against the sole of his feet, not giving like sand, not leaning like grasses, and saw the St. Lawrence splintered by islands, but still straight, still carrying in it the power of 100 unreleased springs, gathered from Superior, from Huron, from Erie, from granite, unforgiven in sun, unblessed by wind of summer. Cold core, spitting seed of unrepentant seasons into water, and finally flowing tideward to the sea. And he knew all this, though he'd never seen it, as though the blood could remember, bone respond, as if his walks through the red and feel of tide's pull were rehearsal for this, for quiet, unbidden connection. As if the journey of Jean-Baptiste Legimaudière with wife and seed of child Québécois were more than man crossing wilderness to valley beyond. Or did the first French feel this? Champlain stepping out of Europe's arc onto basic rock. Could primal granite dislocate the blood? A cranium break at the seams? A wanderer over waters go mad as silence bloated his French words until all meaning cracked? Could there be connection then? Or only event? A ship swamped, a mind uncaulked. Could blood listen then? The bone memorize? And was that child with seed of Quebec and far more distant loins in him more than first white child born to prairie? So that his own blood, here and now on a wharf in Montreal, with strange waters moving by him to even stranger seas, could stir, could feel, could make a quiet linking of hands. It had been a moment at the beginning. After that, of course, there had been Colder Stone of the Seminary, College of Montreal, where faith was broken into years. Latin, syntax, method, versification, belles lettres, rhetoric, philosophy, and days were porridge, mass, butter on saints' days, boiled beef, vespers, a bath on Saturdays, and poplar trees looking inward to the playground where there were no games nor trees, and sometimes on holidays a glimpse of McGill or Sherbrooke Street, or feel of cobbles leading down to water. Monsieur Lenoir Roland smiled with his eyes on the page before him. The dark syllables grew together, and a bell sounded somewhere within. Moses confronted by a burning bush that made the sky around it only blacker. David fondling a smooth stone, fingers seeking the spring of its power. But most of the time there was simply loneliness. It was not the great loneliness of a people, the kind that came suddenly in the councils when the dialogue slowed, seemed to lose its current, and the stillness came swelling up from below like one of the old songs, unbidden, wordless, was there whenever a Métis met his likeness coming out of a distance and sun, and eyes found one another, and the old greeting was returned. And then each would look out across the grasses, across vast plains molded by sky and loved by winds, and then look back, knowing the other had looked too, but not saying, only feeling. And they went their way. No, it was not the great loneliness of a people. Just the common sadness of living one's days without the voice of his mother or his sisters, of gray walls one could never make his own. They were the prairie's as much as the prairie was theirs, with wind between them. Of well-meaning priests trying to carry God on their tongues, on their hands, in their arts, though God was elusive as rivers flowing. How did the water move and yet remain the same? Did it end with sea, or did the sea come back like dust and the wind? He had come back at last. 7 years endured. A father dead, a prairie in disarray, and this flowing, coiled inside like a smooth stone.
Tuesday evening, April 26th, 1870, Ottawa. Sir John A. Macdonald.
They were gone, and the room was his own again. On the sideboard, American mahogany, the finest, one of the advantages he supposed of reciprocity, the French port, untouched, smiled through crystal warmly, despite the sudden chill which the four gentlemen had left behind them, along with some scraps of parchment there on the desk, waiting the cold scrawl of a quill across them. So they would call it Manitoba after all. Not much to choose, one Indian name for another, he supposed. A great slab of rock they couldn't even build a road through. That idiot Dennis couldn't survey any better than he could soldier. And the sly Schultz, and the insufferable mayor with his interminable iambics, God! The water in the basin was still warm, so that he was able to wash his hands, turning them over and over as if he were praying, perhaps, and had forgotten momentarily the first words. Richo had been difficult from the beginning. There was always something distasteful about priests, a kind of slickness as their robes brushed the carpet, the way their fingers moved as they talked, like oiled tongues, crosses dangling, twisting lamplight into one's eyes. And he had had his way, despite the endless babble of French that passed between him and Cartier. One was always between, rarely on one side or the other, and never on top, never looking down. Once Cartier had said to him, after the fourth glass, that Parliament should have been built at the juncture of the two rivers, so that it might feel the subtle pressure of both currents, merge and flow as one stream to the embracing sea, where it... But they had both laughed at the same time, and taken a fifth. The stuffed chair, she disapproved, had sought out the peculiar bent of his back once again. It was getting quite good at it, really, and he wanted for a moment just to sit there for a long time, to let the room speak to him of old familiarities. The cigar box Agnes had given him, with the grotesque Indian head feathered all over it, the cut glass decanter, now winking purply. But there was the parchment, the 5 days of sweating and chilling by turns in this room, with the oily priest, the black judge, the pliable Scot, and the wheedling Cartier. And behind them all, a relentless lance of imperial power, and the democratic hysteria south of the line. And further west, on the preposterous, buffalo-ridden grasslands of nowhere, a swarthy, seedy half-breed with messianic dreams in his breechclout, God. So one was always between, turning and being turned. putting his business together like blocks of wood, making them fit sometimes when grains crossed, and having warm water in the basin, and port on the patient sideboard, looking blindly with stubs of finger for the entire piece, the shape of a whole continent, parallel, meridian, twinned rivers, current compatible, never knowing what the reality was, nor when. Perhaps there was more reality, he thought now, in that other distant room, where the pillowed body of his daughter lay in its hand-carved cradle, the two large eyes slack, his own, the heavy lips formed to a smile that would be endless and meaningless. They both knew now, learned it daily in one another's look, each seeking the strength of the other's endurance, afraid. Or perhaps these gnawing notes from the merchant's bank, or the stubborn fist of pain in his lower back, these were more real, could bring him down. In his lower back were more real, could bring down his so carefully contrived nation of blocks, could bring down upon his unholy head the whole house of his comings and doings. He wasn't afraid, though, of country's collapse. A sudden current turned awry, so much as he feared an old man's dream that came to him occasionally, like a slash of light crossing his sleep, of a ragamuffin Glasgow boy, with soot-stained palms held out to prayer, and longing for a lost highland, stroked with heather, ringing with sun. In his blood the wine was weaving its own dark river.
Letter to the Globe. From all accounts, the atmosphere in this region must have been in disgusting condition last summer. The grasshoppers were as snow in the air and as flakes of snow upon the ground. They penetrated into the parlour kitchens, bedchambers and bedding, pots, pans, kettles, ovens, boots and coat pockets. On the rivers they floated like scum or were piled 2 feet deep on the banks, where they rotted and stunk like carrion. Every green thing begot of man's toil disappeared before them. Signed, Charles Mayor.
April 1870. Sir Stafford Northcote to Disraeli. Bad news. Sir John A. has broken out again.
Letter to the Globe. Now that the buffalo have retreated southward and are threatened with speedy extinction, the half-breeds who live by the chase will be compelled to betake themselves to their farms. It is possible that the bison herds will return again, but the buffalo hunt could never be the thing it was. The herds, hemmed in on all sides, are now decreasing rapidly, and their total extinction may be looked for in a few years. Formerly they were inconceivably numerous. On the march their trampling shook the earth, and their bellowing resounded over the prairie like thunder. Signed, Charles Mayor.
Connection, he knew, was so much more than event. The single rivering of man's thought broadened seaward slowly to vision. Could clay banks or gravel bed render shape to its flowing? Or did current cut its own way over granite, offering form to the rock that resisted it, and taking from resistance speed and will greater than rock or water, and a final shaping that was neither flowing nor bending to bank? There had been events enough to mark the water's course, to give it line enough for history, or politics, or simple meanness of man. Perhaps tonight would mark a sudden swerving, a waterfall. Who could know? Wolseley marching through the black rain, the mutiny of summer. He and O'Donoghue waiting and trusting. Were those figures out there soldiers moving blackly through the dusk, emerging out of mud itself? This was event, or would be, looking back or down. And yet, so had been the coming of MacDougall, Métis horsemen confronting him with their pride only and winning. And the arrogance of Schultz and Bolton striking from behind, believing only in the final argument of a gun, and Scott, the blasphemer, fouling dust with his spittle, offering the logic of fists there on the street at Fort Garry, with everyone seeing. Those fists delivered their message of rage against his chest. Other hands intervened, though eyes had watched and saw. Still, a government had been formed, the great paper drawn up and carried eastward, on a west wind blowing benevolence of man and prairie that would prevail beyond the dreaming time of men or Métis or one Louis Riel. For event had been met not by the cannon which throttled the mad Schultz, 40 of them crawling, bowing their way past the armed Métis to the prison at Fort Garry. Not by the violence which saw that young half-wit dying by the roadside, his head hacked open, and Sutherland, boy too, slaughtered on an errand of mercy. Not by the seizing of Bolton or the execution of Scott, 6 Métis, half-drunk, bullets cold into 20 below, 3 of them warm in Scott's body, still kneeling, not believing this, nor breath that could not come, nor coldness that was sudden inside and not the morning's. Blood coiling, darker than vengeance on the snow. No, event had met or been met by the rivering of vision, and surely the sea would wait. There had been, of course, the 2 rivers once before, the journey to Quebec and the journey back. And when they had become one, he did not know. Perhaps had been one all the time. But he did know that part of the flowing came with the buffalo. It began with the gathering at Pembina. 1,000 carts drawn from a rim of prairie flatness, along the straight spokes of the wind to a single hub. It began anew each spring as if it had not happened before, after the ploughing and the planting, though it was never spoken. Only a life excitement, swelling to the eye like an alien sap, pulled memory of root and rock. The instincts stirred. 1,000 ploughs abruptly stopped, seed abandoned to the sun, and one horizon rimmed with clouds of the great gathering as the Métis spirit moved with the ancient wind and the ancient ways. And he remembered, with all the clarity of 10-year-old wonder looking up and around, that one time his mother had let him go, her soft palms holding his, pressing them, only letting go when male voices rang from the roadway just beyond their garden, and the young wheat not able yet to stand up straight. He had clambered about the cart among the strong smells, old buffalo robes with the smell of humans on them now. June nights could be cold. The gunpowder in gleaming masculine horns, tallow, grease, leather, and above all, the smell of sky, drifting forever into roundness of earth, and the wheels turning beneath him in endless, diminutive repetitions. He watched the days and nights circle over, under, around him, and he dreamed of the buffalo. There was one captain he watched and listened to when he could sneak close to their councils in the evening. A tall man with a carved face and arms like oak, with a bright slash of Assumption across his buckskin shirt, and 3 ox feathers on the cockade of his hat, and calves that flowed out of his leggings like a long vertical grain against the horizontal dust. And sometimes he listened to the full-blooded Cree, who galloped by them on the back of his white buffalo runner, who told the waiting circle of boys nightly how he still hunted the old way, and showed them stubs of finger as the fire polished his renegade eyes. He liked the evenings best, fire bringing the blood back to the skin, fatigue draining away through secret brooks in the flesh, and languorous arms of white smoke lazy on the dampness, the ground chill at the buttocks, the air pricking the cheeks till sleep seized him, body and spirit, and he dreamed again of buffalo. One evening, when the sun had surrendered to the south, sun was always south on the prairie, even in June, always distant, as if it could not hope to own this greater sky above them, there came a new and strange light, not out of sun, or distantly from seed of stars, or blind from moon, but a wind light out of darkness, out of north, out of the whole skies flowing into the hushed ring of their house. Campfires dead, prairie stillness, a wind of light and curved coloring, and phantasmagoric dance till sky and earth were one river with its moving. Afterwards, in the new darkness, he heard the old prayers coming across the circle on voices so thin that his ear leaned into them, felt their quiver, their long grain, their life juices, until he knew the strangeness of, though didn't understand, that one forbidden incantation. O Chepuyuk, let my blood be wind. Though the priests only half disapproved, as if there were, perhaps, something there. At last, on the seventh day, the buffalo, brown tides of them moving as if the prairie were turning, were lifting their dust, raised behind them a questioning shroud, a memory of plague curving into sky and all forgetfulness, while the land tremored, tried to hold the thunder of tides imploding, hundred-hoofed downward through grasses, through dust, to mothering earth. They came to them downwind, the old captain's head setting the pace. No one would pass them till the first shot had been fired. The boys, well behind, without guns, eyes cocked, tension, a hair trigger inside them. He had seen the Erd suddenly below, brown swell at ebb now, grass wave rippling through the coulee. The first shot, louder than sound, wind holding it, letting it drop, dead stone through the still surface, and the great bulls moving in their thunder with them. He could not see for the dust, but the Blood Cree had carved his story well, and he knew the bulls would be back, with angry hooves and rage of shoulders turning beneath them, a brown muscle of earth, feeling their own thunder pound through shank to straight brain, knowing sky could not hold its loudness, would give it back through ear to blood and final pride of being. Till Métis huntsmen, braving dust and vengeful oaths, would ride into panicked water, gun poised till they could see the eye of the bison, and with a single snap strike its pride. Although the tide rolled over it, carried horse and rider to the next eye, and another blow, till the herd had scattered, broken its flowing, and the Métis turned back triumphant, to count the corpses spread upon the grass, and feel the dust settle like a second wind upon the prairie and its wound. Then the women would come with their quietness and the old ways, their knives cutting the newly dead flesh with a care born of many winters' hungering, peeling back the robes which would keep them from cold and shame of death with no dignity. And the sweet smell of slaughtering was on the air, and the wind itself seemed to be blowing blood. He knew then, as now, watching the braves and captains return to camp with more than tiredness in their bones, the braggart tongues limp, muscles sheathed, quiescent, spirits blending with sun's ebb and death of summer. Knew then, as now, that pride was thunder's answer on the ear. A moment of lightning when I struck earth of turning shoulders, touched the sky's rage, knew that living, that being alive was somehow death in the dark dance of wills and the ooved wind. So that the slow journey homeward, with 1,000,000 pounds of pemmican wrapped in buffalo hide, was not so much living as it was preparation for the time when his people would live again their moment of lightning. Still, there was order and dignity. The meat was shared and labors apportioned with equal care as the wagons moved across the prairie in a single body, languorously, as if the limbs had known one another a long time, remembering, trusting, moved dreamily, as if the great feast were complete, and the guards secured, and night sky benign above them, and altar candles flaming, calm as the wind of Christ's whisper between the stillness and the waiting.
We was driving them hard, see? So as them big bulls was pretty near climbing up the arse end of the cows. They always running back up 'em, see? And they was kicking up a storm of dust so we could hardly see. A noise was like thunder right inside your head, see? We kept on a-driving them. The silly bastards never knowed they was heading for the bluff. Well, you know the one, over there past Pamela Mountain. Drop off 60 foot or more. Till all of a sudden, they're right there, see? And we're still driving them like crazy. And then noise stops real quick. Like the thunder just quit and scuttled back into the clouds, see? And there was no noise. Only the dust lifting up, slow and easy. And we could see down there, see? Yes, sir, we seen 300 of them cows and bulls. The bones sticking out like a bunch of felled trees, all splintery and blood squirting every which way. Some of them legs was still twitching. And there was no noise at all, no certain none. Except the thunder. It come back way inside, real queer like. Me and them Americans, we go down there, see, and we got the tongues out of them bulls, pretty near 200 souvenirs. Oh, by God, fellas, I tell you, I ain't had so much fun since. I ain't never smelt such a smell since. Except in here, Matey's dungeon, these here Matey's guards. I tell you that there half-breed antichrist is going to end up just like them bulls at the bottom of some cliff. The only thunder is going to be me laughing. Just laughing. Laughing. Thomas Scott, Fort Garry Prison, January 1870.
And so it had come to this, waiting for Wolseley and his troops to assume form out of wilderness like black flies at the first heat, and not knowing. He had had to kill Scott. Would have done the same for Bolton, too, if the murdered boy's mother had not come like that, kneeling before him, her hands upon his, her lips shaping prayers that belonged to another, to one great enough to forgive. Scott had deserved death, for he was a symbol of all that stood in the way of their hopes. Division. Canadian, Orangeman, bigot, blasphemer, a man without root, with no touch of the soil in him or wind on him. He'd voted death with the others. 4-3, his vote cancelling mercy, because the flowing inside was too strong, needed resistance of this rock to give it will and final direction. It was not Scott's fists there on the street, nor shame of eyes watching, seeing. And yet, the soldiers were coming, and this earth would ripen with their bayonets. Could current be turned that easily? Be blocked this close to sea? Or could it carry some darkness of its own? Scott's blood, a black coil on the innocent morning. Outside, night gathered the rain unto itself in a dark hoarding, and wind was an ancient plague settled around his house, black and wet and awkward, the cloak of a stranger.
Elk Island, August 23, 1870. My dearest father, I have lost count of the number of times I have wished myself back home since this glorious campaign began. I hope you will not think me a coward or a traitor in any sense, for it is not the purpose of our journey that I have doubted. The CBCRiel shall dangle from our bayonets before September is the nightly song in our camps. Nor have I complained, as others have, of the unendurable hardships we suffer each day. 47 portages thus far. Rather, it is a strange kind of indignity which disturbs me, an indignity which seems both a physical assault and a spiritual affront. I cannot readily explain it, except to say that it is related to the travails of our voyage. 2 or 3 times a day we have to unpack the canoes and then push them over log rollers or carry them to the next river or lake. Till the hands bleed below yesterday's calluses, we could not hold our rifles even if we desperately needed to. At Lake Superior, not only the shale and boulders of the great cliffs blocked our way, but the pines, hundreds of years old, seemed for no apparent reason to have collapsed across the road, almost as if we were intruders. And for weeks we cut and pulled and dragged our fatigued bones through the most abominable bushland known to men. Many times we have fallen into icy waters, so that the cold seizes you whole, grips you to the bone. Then on the rocks or the flat calm of a lake, the sun bakes your skin dry, shrivels your tunic, and later, after camp is made in the bush, you huddle by the fire and feel the night like a stiff palm on your backbone. And yet you do not want to stand, for the others will see your shrunken, pitiful uniform, or the crook in your spine, and know your shame. And you do not want others to stand either. And sleep comes and seizes you mercifully. With the dawn, a new sun on the rock and in the eyes. Also, one sees the dysentery and feels not so much the pain, so clearly visible, the slight hunch of the back, the shortened stride, the glisten of bravado in the eye, but rather the total indignity of the disease, as if the uniform had become suddenly too large, the body trying to huddle inside, trying to close over the pain. No one has died yet, and for that we thank the Lord daily, and Colonel Wolseley, whose courage and determination have been exemplary. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of these travails is beginning to tell on me, and others, I'm certain. Always now I shade my eyes from the sun. The pine darkness seems to strike terror into me. I feel as if the water will not hold the canoe. I step cautiously on each rock, for fear it will betray. And all the time my tunic shrinks and clings, and the calluses multiply on my palms, and I do not look others in the eye. Then, yesterday afternoon, before we reached the river, the most terrible event of all occurred. It was a hot August day, the sweat soaking right through to our muscle ache. We were grateful for the flatness of the prairie and long strides again that seemed to stir our wearying sense of honor. It all began with a shout from one of the Métis guides. We looked up to see what appeared to be a black thunderhead gathering in the west and coming towards us. There were no other clouds in the sky, and the noise was not thunder, but a loud humming, which grew darker and louder with each second. Our guides dropped straight to the earth and buried themselves in their blankets just as the storm burst upon us, dark and whirling like an Old Testament plague. It was neither plague nor rain, but mosquitoes. 1,000,000 of them gathered in a single monstrous cloud. In minutes they were gone, a faint shroud disappearing on the horizon. But they had left our flesh humiliated, skin torn apart and festering, and that unearthly hum forever avenging our ears. An hour later, the rains came. It has been raining now for 40 hours. Our tents have been blown apart or away by the most virulent summer wind I have ever known, a wind that rises from every corner of the prairie, blind with a biblical fury. And we are here on this island, this bleak station 6 miles from Fort Garry and our triumph, wet and cold and naked. We are as strangers in a stranger's house. Yours respectfully, Sergeant.
Baker just says, "Now, boys," says he, "that's the devils. Just go in and clear them out. No darn prisoners, you know. Uncle Sam ain't a-going to keep prisoners, I guess. No darn squaws or young'uns, but just kill 'em all, squaws and all. It's them squaws what breed 'em, and them young'uns will only be horse thieves or hair lifters when they grows up." So the boys just turned over the lodges and fixed them as they lay on the ground. There was up to 170 of them pagans wiped out that morning. There was only one of the boys sent under by a redskin firing out at him from inside a lodge. I say, mister, that Baker's a bell ox among soldiers. You bet. Report on the 1870 Pagan War. The first great lesson in good manners taught the savage of this territory.
I sent my young men to light fires inside and outside the deserted teepees, placing conveniently at the door of the front teepees sticks dressed like men, and to put up stakes in the front streets of the village to which were tied pieces of blankets, so that when the fires were burning fiercely and stirring the air, the pieces of cloth and old rags waved to and fro in the breeze and gave the appearance of a densely populated village. Then I marched behind the front row of hills with all my braves and awaited the opening of the soldiers' fire upon my camp. Everything worked as I had planned. True to their intentions, the United States soldiers killed my flagmen whom I had sent to meet them and demand peace, and proceeding furiously forward, opened fire upon my empty camp of old teepees and rag mannequins. I then fell upon them from the rear with all my forces,
before they had time to recover from the shock of their furious charge and their surprise at finding the village deserted. My men destroyed the last of them in a very short time. Now they accuse me of slaying them. Yet what did I do? Nothing. God saved our lives because we had called upon him. They should then accuse God, for truly it was he who saved us. Tantanka Yatanka, Sitting Buffalo, known as Sitting Bull, describing the Battle of the Little Bighorn, 1876.
Beauport Asylum, January 1878. Like an elk, they had pursued him, driven him from the closeness of brush, the nearness of water, from the sun that was his own because it came through branches and over leaf and lake with the same slant each day. They had hunted him down in his own wood, and he had fled, and Lapine with him, through darkness, the moon bright on their cowardice. But what could they do, with wolves marauding through the fort in Saint Boniface, poking cold eyes into the corners of his house, his mother and sisters frightened, and Louis fled, and Métis blood was spilled. An old man hounded into the red and stoned from shore until he dared not come up again, and let the waters bear his death. And there were women, too, violated by that pack from Canada, and Louis scurried into Minnesota with one eye out for the shadow of hawks. He had come back, of course, with cover of darkness and many friends, had stood for election, and taken the seat at Provencher, a Métis gift to Cartier, and then had taken it again, though he would never return to his homeland even under cover of friends. Could it be that hawks had eyes for this moon, wings whirring through boughs, night wind breathing fear? And one Louis Riel, MP, alone in a room, on a street in St. Cloud. Terror in every corner with eyes, Schultz seen from one window, 4 conspirators caught in Montreal, secret oaths sworn on every orange sword, and overcoats bulging with hidden guns, every glance concealing murder. And Louis Riel fleeing across a continent. The contained loneliness of trains, of depots, of cities. Chicago, Washington, New York, Montreal, strangers in stone. And Ottawa. A last flight to the shadow of the gray towers, the chambers of justice. The mahogany bar of law before which his ancestors had trembled. Tongues, unable to speak their fear, their confusion, had signed his name in the book of law, had not trembled, though darkness was welcome as they slipped back to all. He knew then that wilderness was more than Moses wandering the desert land, and more than heartache or separation or longing for home and the soul of his lost people. For he would endure other humiliations and worse. MacDonald's agents with their dollars and he before them, shame in his upturned palms lifting to dollars, to the coin of banishment. And marveling when no lightning came, no earth moved in trepidation. Then the wandering, with the prairies still in him and the voices of his people weaving a dark and sinister current through the seams of his flesh, breaking cataracts at last, in caverns the mind would not confront. And they said he was mad. They came, hawks out of wind, talons through my eyes, crows on carrion wind. Schultz, in every corner of this darkness, smile of secret knives. Cockroaches crawl from dust of my desire. Death is buffalo broken by cliffs, 4 feet sticking up into stiff wind. Blood on the tongue, all the sun's hardness. Prairie blows through ears bereaved of pride. The fallen grasses shattered. Wind song of brass. Judah stalking darkness, silver branching his blood. This garden is cold. The flowers wait. Is there no rope in Jerusalem round enough? Golds tarnish out of roundness, out of prairie. Dust comes, fungus black, gathering coin, branching in blood of Judas and all Jerusalem. And this garden, dust of words and flowers, dead with glitter of wind's gold and silver pilgrimage to my soul. And God has left this dark Gethsemane where only my words now rage. Death is in the wheat choked with rust. Death is in the earth my man sees. Is a black wind blowing up the coulee, blowing over the buffalo slaughtered on the grass, blowing on the Métis languishing in Manitoba, in Pembina, in Dakota, and on the brown banks of the Saskatchewan. Coil, waiting for a black wind or a lash of lightning to set the willow bush ablaze, make this northern sky a second arc of flame. Release of these dark waters, turn of my heart, the pump of my lungs, the locked cry in my throat, waiting for God's call to Moses to move through earth's corruption is wind seed of words, and the land and my soul shall be one flood. They said he was mad no longer, that he could go, for the dreams had not come in more than a month. The voices stilled, but not because his madness had flown like the fleeting violence of a summer storm, but rather because he had no more cause for dream. From his soul's crucible had come the shape of lightning, leaving a groove of brightness deeper than daylight and longer than darkness. He would walk from this place with a dream like a wind blowing through his blood, would walk with his word, and the word would be with him. One voice of God calling through wilderness, his endlessly single, never recurring syllable. Rise up, Louis David Riel. And I came. It was the hour of lilacs, a time for wind stillness, and scent of evening bringing shade and touch of night to come. Small breezes brushing light air along the back of one's palms, a time of waters standing and wet smell rising, and elms lifting, not for wind already past, but shaking a dust of last light out of leaves, or just a shivering before the cool descent in this hour of lilacs, before dusk and after day. She loved him for talking in the old way like that. Her eyes would change, lighten, and her face would move and mold itself around them. Then he'd tell her of the time of the trout moving in the brook, or the hour of the sun standing straight in the pond, or the season of the long line on hills, or the month of the high sky with grey geese going, of the hour of lilacs, which was only in the late spring before the heat, when the evenings were cool, and the wind went with the sun, and lilacs, bending, became the color and the scent and the curve of evening. Their incense lay on the tongue, lips bore their moisture, eyes their mauve, blood breathed and swam with the heaviness of their bloom. And in this hour they would become their wishes, would be the lovers their dreams had prophesied, Louis and Evelina making an hour of their own, a time for lilacs, and no one to let them fall.
Keysville, New York, February 1879. My dearest Louis, last spring I so often saw you working around the house, either helping Monsieur Contant or alone, and this year you are very far away from us, but in thought we are always near you. Monsieur Contant has finished the seeding. Today he is planting trees in the flower garden. The air smells sweetly of spring. Beautiful nature, which quickens to life at first breath, fills me with joy and revives me. I often go out and sit under the lilacs, which are about to bloom. I hasten to gather a few blossoms to give you. I am carried back to that time when we were so happy, both of us seated on the same bench. I have just come from praying at Mary's altar in the church. Her altar is nicely decorated. We have surrounded it with our house bouquets. She is beautiful, Mary, amidst all that foliage. Your affectionate little sister, Evelina Barnaby.
A dream of morning and mountains and sacramental air, clean as sun rounding sheer cliff, and 4 horsemen coming out of sun and stark against the mist, distilling sacramental power of new morning, and mountains' clarity describing riders out of sky, of Dakota, of destiny. And no word to be spoken, because this was second coming, and blood of David was full with morning and mountains moving.
Our boys!
A royal welcome to the brave.
Toronto on freight!
100,000 people jubilant.
The popular heart stirred.
A banquet was given last evening at the Criterion Restaurant by Loyal Orange Lodge number 140 for the purpose of celebrating the 5th of November and presenting medals to several members of the lodge who had seen service recently in putting down the Northwest Rebellion. About 60 brethren sat around the festive board. The cloth being removed, the chairman called upon the brethren to charge their glasses, and then proceeded to give the usual loyal and patriotic toasts. Mr. J.L. Hughes said it was a privilege to celebrate the brave deeds of the past. He urged all Orangemen to be as true as were their forefathers of 280 years ago. They had difficulties to face, which, although unlike those of the past, they must, as men, face and conquer. Their enemies were as ready at present as ever they were to lay the train, to put dynamite under the Parliament buildings, to blow them up, and all Protestants if possible. he called on them to be true to the maple leaf as Canadians, and to the Bible and the Crown as Orangemen. Article in the Mail.
A dream of brown Saskatchewan's double-flowing, vital mud, trout and eel and otter, and seed of spring to come, and leaf of recent falling, life of waters, willowed, rooted, flowered, purple crocus and bend of grass, willow Saskatoon, red berry coolness, current of mud, doubled and brown in summer rhythm, over prairie and under sun, bearing seed and brain, love and season to a single rivering, to one Saskatchewan.
Northwest Heroes.
Return of the Midlanders and the 9th Voltigeurs.
Cordial reception at Owen Sound.
They are most hospitably entertained by the ladies.
Orations all along the line.
Triumphant march through the streets.
Riel's case has been disposed of by the court of last resort. His counsel asked the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council to grant an appeal, principally on the ground that the Northwest Court had no jurisdiction, and that the 6 jurymen by whom the prisoner had been convicted did not constitute a jury within the meaning of the law. But the committee has dismissed the motion, and the verdict rendered at Regina 3 months ago remains undisturbed. The only plea left to Riel's friends is the one of insanity. It is alleged that he is a monomaniac on certain subjects, the victim of delusions regarding religion and his so-called mission to establish a republic on the Saskatchewan. But the jury could not be convinced that the prisoner, when he took up arms and planned the Indian Rising, did not know that he was doing wrong. On the contrary, their verdict of guilty implied that they found him a free and responsible agent who had willfully broken the law. And we presume that the sentence of the court will be duly carried out, and Riel executed for his crime. Editorial, The Mail.
A dream of midnight at Duck Lake, and darkness in the hollow parts of the blizzard, and Métis blood, a scarlet blade sheathed by snow, and air tin as wafer and wine, of cold rising to brain, of David clinging to crucifix as redcoats come like Romans out of white thunder. Dumont dead, bullets scything, flesh spilled, cold crumbles, intoxication of scarlet darkness, bodies with the weight of death in them, Dumont's face smashed, a broken blade midnight come back to Duck Lake. Blizzard of word within, zero of doubt at bone. Crucifix searing the palms of David.
Hurrah, hurrah! The Bon Marché, open till 10 tonight, welcomes the brave boys with a discount of 25% off gents' furnishings. Farley and Company, 7 and 9 King Street East.
To the editor of the Mail, neither religion nor nationality should screen a murderer, be he English, Scotch, Irish, French, Canadian, or half-breed. Nothing of the kind should be considered, and thank God it is seldom spoken of in Canada. I am no bigot. I like the French Canadian as well as I do the English. They've always been a quiet and law-abiding people, and the majority of them take no part with a murderer. Yours, etc. Canadian, Township of Hamilton.
To the editor of the Mail, I am quite at a loss to understand the sentiment and humbug indulged in by a host of people in behalf of the condemned malefactor in question. I am an Englishman, but I am sure my sympathies in no case imaginable would be with a monster guilty of the crimes perpetrated by Riel, no matter how English such a wretch might be. I take it likewise that no good and properly balanced French-Canadian will sympathize with Riel. Yours, etc., A.E. Ridley, St. Thomas.
A dream of greenness and grove, the valley of Batoche with wine of mist and morning, sound of rosary rising thin as noon sun, coming down to lips of David trembling, holy rings on the water, and river moving shadows of twilight sun, slanting arrows the crucifix rejects. A dream of Batoche and battle, of holy war with blood on the leaves, smoke on the sun, gatling jam of silence, rosary and curses, bullets tremble, open wound of mourning, no sun to challenge David or dare his crucifix to damnation. Smoke and blood and bullets mesh to grove and greenness of valley, crucible, apocalyptic darkness.
Riel is to be executed at Regina at 8 o'clock this morning. There's never been any doubt of his guilt. In fact, he confessed it by pleading insanity. He had a fair trial, and his counsel have been permitted to exhaust all the forms and technicalities of the law and the Constitution in their efforts to save him from the consequences of his own deliberate acts. The crime of which he was convicted is the most heinous known to our code, and no extenuating circumstances were discoverable. Lastly, it was the felon's second offense, the death penalty passed on him on a previous occasion having been commuted to 5 years' banishment. Under such circumstances, no one can successfully challenge either the justice of the sentence or the necessity for inflicting it. Riel had forfeited his life, and as it valued law and order in the Northwest and the maintenance throughout the Dominion of an equal scale of justice for French and English alike, the administration was bound to make an example of him. There was no case for the exercise of mercy. He showed none to his own prisoner at Old Fort Garry. He had no sort of claim on the consideration of the government, for from the first to the last, as the Catholic missionaries and his half-breed victims testified, his conduct was that of a selfish, cowardly, and unscrupulous adventurer. The removal of such an enemy of society leaves the world no poorer, whilst it bears witness to all men that neither political influences nor the prejudices of race are sufficiently strong in Canada to shield this evildoer from the penalty of such violated law. Editorial, The Mail.
So it had come down to this. Not a valley or a wilderness, but this courtroom, and these faces that were strangers now, and this smell of wood decaying, his hand on the box, feet on this floor. Though the varnishing gleamed like a second sun, he could smell wood rotting at the pith, like earth, soured and no greenness to it, no scent of growing, of stored sun springing into wheat and waiting sky. Had come to this town, squared to prairie with straight streets and houses angled, and the steel of railways like a bullet through the prairie's heart, land of rectangular fields and sun mitered the sky, intelligence of steel and wood rotting on the nostrils. It had come to this, out of sacramental morning and dream of one Saskatchewan, and midnight at Duck Lake and twilight over Batoche, where they had held true to the straightness of their art, where they had gathered to themselves a last corner of north, had arrowed a place in the private sun, had known the darkness that came welling up the blood and into the eyes and through the nostrils and over the tongue, came flooding out of sky and prairie and grasses, and buried the last of their valleys. They would bear it all right, as he would bear this, because they were a people, and because they knew what it was to be a man and make one's choice and stand. Until now, I have been considered insane, or criminal, or just someone to be shunned. So there was hostility, there was contempt, or there was avoidance. Today, by the verdict of the court, one of those three situations has disappeared. I suppose that after being condemned, I shall cease to be called a fool. And for me, it is a great advantage. If I have a mission, I say if for the sake of those who doubt, but for my part it means since I have a mission, I cannot fulfill my mission so long as I am being looked upon as an insane being. If there has ever been any contradiction in my life, it is at this moment. And do I appear excited? Am I very irritable? Can I control myself? The smile that comes to my face is not an act of my will so much as it comes naturally from the satisfaction that I experienced seeing one of my difficulties disappearing. Should I be executed, I would not be executed as an insane man. It would be a great consolation for my mother, for my wife, and for my children, for my brothers, for my relatives, even for my protectors, for my countrymen. I have been hunted like an elk for 15 years. David had been 17. I think I will have to be about 2 years still. But I hope it will come sooner. You will excuse me. You know my difficulty in speaking English, and have had no time to prepare your honor. And I wish you would excuse what I have to say, the way which I will be able to perhaps express it. Besides clearing my career of the stain of insanity, I think the verdict is proof that I am more than ordinary, that the help which is given to me is more than ordinary. I think I have been called on to do something which at least in the Northwest nobody has done yet. And in some way, I think that to a certain number of people, the verdict against me today is proof that maybe I am a prophet.
Rhythms under sun.
Maybe Riel is a prophet. He suffered enough for it.
Saskatchewan's
The
waters
troubles of the Saskatchewan are not to be taken as isolated fact.
St. Lawrence
They are
and
the result
Winnipegossis,
of 15 years
willowed and rooted and flowered,
difficulty lies in the
with
difficulty of Red
thunder
River.
of buffalo's tide,
If we cannot have our
of
seventh
oak
of
shoulder,
lands from Canada,
and long
we will
grain
ask the
reaching
people of the
for
States,
7
the
to the
Italians,
sky,
to come and help us. As
and
immigrants.
long route reaching
I said
for
we will
earth
invite the
currents
Italians of the States,
under
the
prayer,
Bavarians.
and feel of
Is
Christ's
Gabriel
blood
Dumont inactive?
towering through
I think
seas
not.
rise.
He is trying to
Touch
save me
a
from this
winged
box,
skies,
but if there is justice,
gathering
as I
fine
still hope,
roundness.
Your Honor, that is all what I have to say.
Jesus, Mary, Joseph, let my blood be wind.
Louis Riel, have you anything to say before the sentence of death is carried out?
Louis Riel, do you know me? Do you remember Thomas Scott? You cannot escape today.
It beats yet. Slightly.
I hope he's without pain.
Oh, quite. All sensation is gone. Dead in 2 minutes. Dead.
The goddamn son of a bitch is gone at last.
of a bitch is gone for certain now.
Above the banks of the ancient Ottawa, grey towers stand.
Well, how did everyone enjoy that? Pretty great, right? I was really impressed when I first heard it with both the quality of the actors and just how well this work translates into a radio play format. It's called a poem for voices after all, and boy does it shine in this environment. I'm really thrilled to be able to share this with everyone, and I think Grandpa is too. It's a work he's proud of, and one that he should be proud of. I think Riel is such a fascinating character, and he continues to compel all these years later. This book matters. It still matters 40-some years later. And to be able to hear an original staging like that is wonderful. Wonderful, and I hope you all feel the same. Thank you so much for listening. It's always a privilege to know that people are interested in Grandpa's work and in our conversations. We did just record another episode, so there will be another proper There and Then coming soon. I'll leave you in suspense about what we'll be discussing, but suffice it to say, it's fascinating. Grandpa has many books of poetry available now in print. You can always just head over to the Black Moss Press website. Marty Gervais at Black Moss Press has always been a great advocate for Grandpa, and he has some fantastic authors over there. So head on over to the Black Moss Press website and check out what they've got. Grandpa's most recent book of poetry from Black Moss is called The Blue Flow Below, released in 2017, and I have in my hand a copy of the newest book of poetry, yet to be released. Inklings, Poems of the Point and Beyond, is due out in the spring. Again, from Black Moss Press, and it's wonderful. Well, I guess that does it for us here. Thank you so much for joining us on There and Then.
But you stopped me saying no. I guess I'll stay on by.